They would later call it a mistake, a misjudgment, even a misunderstanding of authority. But the truth was sharper than any political statement that followed. In the mid-1980s, a covert network of senior U.S. officials inside the White House, the CIA, and the National Security Council made a decision that Congress had already forbidden: to continue funding a secret war in Central America. And to do it, they turned to the one source Congress never imagined: covert weapons sales to a nation officially labeled a state sponsor of terrorism. Weapons to Iran, money to the Contras, denials to the American people. Iran, Contra was not a mistake. It was intentional. The scandal did not begin with guns or missiles. It began with a political defeat. The Reagan administration had promised to stop the spread of left-wing revolution in the Western Hemisphere. Nicaragua, under the Sandinistas, had aligned with Cuba and the Soviet bloc. To the White House, allowing Managua to remain socialist was equal to losing another front in the Cold War. The solution was simple: fund, train, and support the Contras, anti-Sandinista guerrillas attempting to overthrow the government. But there was a problem. Evidence began piling up of atrocities: villages burned, civilians executed, international law broken. Congress took notice, and in 1982, legislators passed the first Boland Amendment. It banned funding of the Contras for the purpose of overthrowing the Nicaraguan government. Washington had spoken clearly. The White House did not listen. Instead, something shifted inside the National Security Council. What had been a foreign policy program became a hidden war, run from offices where secrecy was not a protective layer but the foundation of the mission. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, a Marine officer detailed to the NSC, became the operational architect. He had a core belief that Congress was wrong, that the Contras had to be supported at any cost, and that if lawmakers cut the money, the executive branch would simply have to find more legally or not. A covert financing pipeline began forming, one that blurred the lines between intelligence, diplomacy, and outright illegality. At the same time, a second crisis was underway. In Lebanon, American citizens had been taken hostage by militant groups backed by Iran. The Reagan administration had publicly promised never to negotiate with terrorists. Privately, some senior officials began considering a different path: supplying Iran with weapons in exchange for assistance securing the release of American captives. It was desperate, risky, and directly contrary to U.S. policy. Iran was under a federal arms embargo. But what began as a limited special circumstance proposal soon metastasized into a much wider scheme. Israel, an ally with its own complex relationship to Iran at the time, proposed acting as the initial transfer middleman. The idea was that Israel would ship American weapons to Iran. Iran would pressure its proxies to release hostages. The United States would quietly approve the transaction afterward. Even that plan pushed legality to the limit. But then came the fateful shift. Someone proposed marking up the price of the weapons, skimming off the profit, and using that money to fund the Contra war Congress had just cut off. Two crises, hostages in the Middle East and a proxy war in Central America, suddenly fused into a single covert financing machine. This was not a plan Congress debated. It was not something reviewed by constitutional oversight committees. It was born in offices behind closed doors, in safes filled with classified memos, and in handwritten notes later shredded in panic. Oliver North and a small circle of advisors began coordinating secret flights, offshore bank accounts, falsified manifests, and unofficial channels with foreign governments. They referred to their growing network as the Enterprise. That word, used repeatedly in the original documents, was not an accident. It reflected exactly how the operation behaved, not like U.S. foreign policy, but like a private covert business functioning parallel to the government, borrowing its power without its accountability. Money from Iranian weapons sales began flowing into Swiss bank accounts. It was routed through middlemen, shell companies, and deniable cutouts. Aircraft chartered under the guise of humanitarian missions carried crates not of medicine or food, but rifles, grenades, ammunition, and communications equipment for the Contras. In official reports to Congress, the administration claimed these operations were limited, humanitarian, or unrelated to U.S. government involvement. None of it was true. The White House was not only coordinating the war, it was funding it in direct defiance of federal law. Inside the State Department and CIA, officers began noticing irregularities, unexplained money, unusual cargo manifests, and diplomatic actions that made no operational sense unless there was a second layer hidden beneath them. Some senior analysts quietly raised concerns, but speaking out against a policy blessed by the highest levels of the executive branch was politically hazardous. The Cold War atmosphere was unforgiving. To question a covert anti-communist program was to risk career, access, and political viability. Many looked the other way, telling themselves the truth would eventually sort itself out. It did, but not the way anyone expected. By 1985, the operation had grown into a fully functioning covert logistics network. But something was about to go very wrong. On October 5, 1986, a chartered C-123 cargo plane was flying a resupply mission over Nicaragua when Sandinista forces tracked and shot it down. 2 men were killed instantly. 1 survived. Eugene Hasenfus, a former Air America and CIA contractor. He parachuted out, was captured, and began telling Nicaraguan interrogators that he was working on resupply operations for the Contras, operations backed by the United States government. For the first time, the secret network had produced a living witness. Washington panicked. Reporters began investigating flight logs, aviation companies, and weapons purchase orders. They discovered that the aircraft was tied to companies connected to prior CIA operations. Sandinista officials put Hasenfus on trial and released evidence they claimed proved U.S. involvement in illegal arms trafficking. The Reagan administration denied everything, insisting that no U.S. agency was involved. But journalists no longer believed the official statements. Too many pieces were lining up. Too many denials sounded rehearsed. Something was hidden, and the political press corps wasn't going to stop. The public unraveling of the scandal accelerated faster than the White House could contain it. Reporters traced the aircraft to a network of shell companies previously used in covert CIA programs in Southeast Asia. The more the administration denied involvement, the more the press dug. And then something devastating happened, not from a journalist, not from a foreign government, but from inside. On November 3, 1986, a Lebanese magazine published a bombshell. Senior U.S. officials had secretly arranged weapons sales to Iran with intermediaries in Israel. The transaction, the report claimed, was part of a deal to secure the release of American hostages in Lebanon. The administration's public position that it would never negotiate with terrorists was exposed as false. It was not a rumor anymore. It was documented. Within 48 hours, every major Western newspaper and television network transitioned from speculation to open investigation. The State Department press room turned into a political battlefield. The administration kept insisting that the arms shipments were strategic diplomatic openings, not ransom. But internal observers already knew something was missing from the official explanations: the money. No one could account for where the profits from the Iranian weapons sales had gone. They were about to. Inside the National Security Council, Oliver North and his staff began shredding documents at a frantic pace. Some destruction orders were carried out on a Sunday to avoid the presence of regular staff. Logs and memos outlining the financial flows were fed into document destruction machines. The operation was not just hurried, it was panicked. Because they all understood one thing: what they had done was not just politically embarrassing, it was criminal. Despite the destruction, some records survived. One of them detailed the diversion of funds from Iranian arms sales to offshore accounts controlled by the enterprise, the financial pipeline sustaining the Contra war. National Security Advisor John Poindexter later testified that he had intentionally not told President Reagan about the diversion, claiming he wanted to shield the president from legal exposure. It was a convenient justification, and one that congressional investigators would dissect with surgical precision. When the diversion became public, the administration shifted from denial to strategic confusion. Statements changed almost daily. First, the White House said no weapons had been traded. Then it admitted weapons had been traded, but not for hostages. Then it acknowledged that hostages had been freed, but not as a result of ransom. Finally, Poindexter and North's testimony forced the White House to acknowledge that profits from the arms sales had funded the Contras. It was a step-by-step collapse of the administration's credibility, every defensive position erased by factual evidence. Congress launched a formal investigation. The televised hearings became one of the largest political spectacles in American history. Millions of citizens watched as Oliver North took the stand in uniform, speaking with confidence, defiance, and a sense of mission. He framed his actions as patriotism, the defense of U.S. national interests against congressional restrictions he believed undermined the Cold War effort. In his own words, he had been operating under presidential authority, even if that authority was never written down, never approved by Congress, and never legal. But the facts were not rhetoric. They were documented, and they painted a picture of a government operating outside the law. Witness after witness revealed a policy structure where accountability had been replaced with improvisation. Legal review was replaced by secrecy, and congressional oversight was treated as an obstacle, not a constitutional requirement. The more the hearings continued, the more one political reality became clear. This was not a rogue officer freelancing from a basement office. The diversion was known to multiple senior officials. Meetings had been held. Foreign governments had been involved. Accounts had been established. Aircraft had been chartered. Logistic networks had been coordinated. And none of it had passed through the systems designed to keep U.S. foreign policy within the bounds of the law. As investigators followed the money, they uncovered something even more disturbing. The operation had been run with the knowledge and involvement of private businessmen and former intelligence operatives who stood to profit personally. The enterprise was not just a covert government operation. It was a semi-privatized shadow foreign policy, where deniable actors handled tasks official agencies could not admit to performing. Meanwhile, international allies were stunned. The United States had accused other nations of supporting terrorism, while secretly selling arms to one of the world's leading state sponsors of terrorism itself. Washington had pressured allies to uphold embargoes it was privately violating. Diplomats scrambled to explain U.S. policy to foreign ministries that no longer believed American statements at face value. The scandal was no longer a question of legality alone. It was one of credibility, consistency, and foreign policy integrity. The United States had been caught breaking its own laws, its own policies, and its own professed principles, all while publicly insisting on moral leadership in the Cold War. Public reaction was fierce. Even Americans who supported a hard line against communism began to question whether the administration had crossed a line that was never meant to be crossed, achieving political goals by circumventing the Constitution itself. And that realization, more than the weapons, the hostages, or the money, transformed Iran, Contra from a political scandal into a constitutional crisis. Because the core question at the center of the hearings was not whether the Contras deserved support or whether negotiating for hostages was wise. The core question was, can the executive branch create its own foreign policy in secret, defying federal law, without accountability to Congress or the American people? For the first time, the answer was on national television, and the country did not like what it saw. The hearings peeled away layers of the operation that had remained hidden for years. What emerged was not a single decision or a single misjudgment, but a systemic breakdown, a parallel chain of command, divorced from accountability, built on the belief that the end justified the means. And in that system, rules became obstacles, oversight became interference, and secrecy became the standard operating procedure. Witnesses described a foreign policy conducted through private couriers, offshore bank accounts, diplomatic pouches, and encrypted telex messages. Aircraft were purchased under false corporate identities. Weapons were routed through Allied intelligence services to avoid detection. Funds were washed through Swiss accounts to remove U.S. fingerprints. No congressional committees were notified. No legal reviews were performed. The Boland Amendments, laws duly passed by Congress, were treated not as binding restrictions, but as tactical challenges to be outmaneuvered. And the public began to realize something even more disturbing. The Iran-Contra operation was not a sudden invention. It had roots, deep ones. Every major intelligence controversy of the prior decade, from Watergate to domestic surveillance abuses, had left behind a legacy of distrust and an expanding web of legal restrictions. Instead of adapting to those new limits, some in the intelligence community and the National Security Council believed the United States needed a backup system, a mechanism that could act when Congress refused, a covert foreign policy infrastructure that could be switched on at will. Iran-Contra proved that the infrastructure existed. It was funded off the books, protected by allies, and answerable only to a small circle of decision-makers. It had its own money pipeline, its own procurement channels, and its own communications. It operated beyond congressional intelligence committees and outside the traditional diplomatic process. It was a shadow system, parallel to the one the Constitution recognized. And for a time, it worked. That was the most chilling lesson. Because as investigators interviewed former CIA officers, Pentagon planners, and NSC staffers, they found that many believed they had done nothing wrong. They believed Congress was the problem. They believed oversight was politically motivated interference. They believed national security justified autonomy. And that mindset, loyal, patriotic, and deeply dangerous, was the ideological fuel that had powered the entire operation. By the spring of 1987, the public began demanding consequences. If private citizens trafficked weapons to a hostile government, they went to prison. If intelligence officers destroyed subpoenaed evidence, they were charged with obstruction. If money was laundered through foreign accounts, prosecutors called it racketeering. The American people wanted to know why the standards changed when the actions were taken from inside government instead of outside it. Dozens of indictments followed. Oliver North, John Poindexter, Richard Secord, Albert Hakim, the list grew. Charges ranged from conspiracy to lying to Congress to obstruction of justice. And for a moment, it looked like accountability was finally coming. But then something happened that would alter the impact of the scandal forever. North's conviction was overturned. Poindexter's conviction was overturned. Many defendants were granted immunity for their testimony. And on Christmas Eve 1992, President George H.W. Bush issued pardons to 6 officials involved in Iran-Contra, including former Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger. The result was clear. No senior official served prison time for the central acts of the scandal. To critics, it looked like confirmation of the worst interpretation of the affair, that the American system had 2 legal standards, one for the public and one for the powerful. To supporters, the pardons represented protection of loyal public servants who had defended U.S. strategic interests during the Cold War. But neither interpretation changed the historical reality. The courts had been prevented from establishing a legal precedent on the limits of covert executive action. And so Iran-Contra entered the historical record with a question unresolved. If the executive branch breaks the law in the name of national security, and those actions are shielded from full legal consequences, where does the boundary of constitutional power truly lie? Even years later, scholars and former intelligence officers continued debating the implications. Some argued that Congress had overreached by restricting policy options during an existential geopolitical struggle. Others insisted that, without constitutional checks, the United States risked becoming a government where foreign policy could be conducted by a handful of men behind closed doors. Both sides agreed on one thing: Iran, Contra had revealed a structural vulnerability in the American system. Because the scandal did not depend on one rogue officer, one secret bank account, or one illegal weapons shipment, it depended on something much simpler: a belief inside government that the mission justified bypassing the law. When the final reports were issued, the language was blunt. The Congressional Committee stated, "The common ingredients of the Iran and Contra policies were secrecy, deception, and disdain for the law." The independent counsel wrote that the White House had participated in a pattern of obstruction and concealment that made accountability nearly impossible. And yet, even with those conclusions, the political shock faded faster than expected. The Cold War ended, new crises emerged, the public moved on. But the intelligence community did not forget, nor did policymakers, because the mechanisms built during the scandal, intertwined networks of covert action, private intermediaries, and deniable logistics, would reappear again in later conflicts, modern counterterrorism operations, and black budget programs that the public would never fully see. Iran-Contra was not just a scandal, it was a blueprint, a demonstration that a determined executive branch, backed by foreign allies and private operators, could conduct sustained covert warfare even when Congress explicitly prohibited it. And that reality forced a final, uncomfortable question, one that still hangs over every democratic government with a powerful security apparatus. If the state can act outside the law in secret, who actually governs? The Iran-Contra investigators understood that they were not simply documenting a single covert program. They were documenting a stress test of the American constitutional system, one that the system did not decisively pass. Because when the documents were subpoenaed, some were shredded. When witnesses were questioned, some lied. When prosecutors tried to establish accountability, critical testimony became shielded by immunity grants. And when convictions finally came, presidential pardons ended the legal consequences. The results sent a message, one noticed around the world. In the United States, a covert operation could violate federal law, bypass Congress, manipulate foreign governments, and still end with no senior official serving prison time. All because the participants claimed their actions were in the national interest. That logic, the logic of emergency, of necessity, of strategic justification, has always been the most dangerous rationale in government. Because every abuse of power throughout history begins by claiming it was required. Iran-Contra showed how easy it was for patriotism to evolve into impunity. The scandal also revealed how fragile oversight mechanisms truly were. Congress controlled funding, yet private donations and foreign contributions filled the gap. Congressional committees demanded information. Yet entire chains of communication existed outside official records. Laws restricted U.S. intelligence activities, but the operation flowed through other nations: Israel, Saudi Arabia, Honduras, Taiwan, allowing Washington to claim distance from its own policy. It created a model for a new kind of foreign intervention, one in which the United States didn't need to deploy troops, didn't need to win votes in Congress, and didn't need to inform the American people. Money, weapons, and strategy could be outsourced to third parties, while the government kept plausible deniability. In Managua, the effects were not theoretical. They were real. The Contra War killed tens of thousands of Nicaraguans, many of them civilians. Villages were raided, infrastructure was sabotaged, and kidnappings, executions, and torture were documented by international observers. Human Rights Watch and the International Court of Justice criticized the U.S.-linked operations. The court ruled that the U.S. had violated international law by supporting the Contra war and mining Nicaragua's harbors. Washington simply rejected the ruling. Another precedent established. As more evidence emerged, Americans began recognizing a pattern that stretched across decades, from coups in Iran and Guatemala to covert wars in Laos, Afghanistan, and Central America. Iran-Contra was not an anomaly. It was part of a tradition, parallel foreign policy conducted through secrecy, deniable logistics, and selective legal interpretation. The scandal proved that American democratic checks were reactive, not preventative. The wrongdoing had not been stopped, it had been discovered after the fact. And even then, many of the key figures responsible avoided lasting consequences. When President Bush issued the 1992 pardons, he made the argument that the indicted officials were honorable men who had acted in good faith. But congressional leaders saw it differently. The chairman of the investigative committee issued a response accusing the administration of blocking justice, preventing a full record, and protecting officials who had acted outside the law. One of them said, "The American people will never know the full truth." That statement was not an exaggeration, because the most explosive question of all remained unresolved. What did the president know, and when did he know it? Reagan testified that he had no knowledge of the arms-for-money diversion. Some investigators believed him, operating on the assumption that subordinates shielded him from the details. Others believed it was impossible that a multinational covert weapons network, spanning 3 continents, operated for 18 months without presidential awareness. But the documents that might have proven the answer no longer existed. They had been shredded. The significance of Iran-Contra did not depend on proving the president's personal involvement. Whether he knew or not, the scandal showed that a small group of officials could conduct an unauthorized foreign war in the name of the United States, and that the system had no immediate, automatic mechanism to stop them. When the final report was issued, it concluded, "A government run by the rule of law cannot endure if its highest officials believe they are above the law." The report was dated 1987, but its warning applies to every modern democracy with a powerful intelligence apparatus. Because Iran-Contra left behind a legacy that intelligence historians still reference. The blueprint of how to run a secret war without congressional approval. In the decades that followed, shades of Iran-Contra appeared again. Covert funding networks, off-the-books operations, foreign intelligence collaboration, executives bypassing legislature in the name of national security, black budgets expanding beyond public scrutiny. And with every crisis, the same question returned. Who controls the hidden machinery of the state? Congress writes the checks, courts interpret the law, but secrecy, real secrecy, puts power in the hands of the people who control the documents, the communications, and the supply chain. Iran-Contra proved that the greatest threats to constitutional democracy do not always arrive as coups, invasions, or assassinations. Sometimes, the greatest threat arrives in the form of a memorandum stamped, "Top secret, EYES only, no distribution." And behind that stamp, a small group of officials decide which laws apply, which do not, and who is allowed to know. That is the legacy of Iran-Contra. A constitutional warning written not in theory, but in operational reality. A demonstration that even in the world's oldest continuous democracy, a determined executive can build a covert foreign policy outside public oversight, outside legislative control, and outside legal boundaries. And once built, it is difficult to dismantle. Because every government has laws. Not every government has accountability.